Okay, hello everyone. Can you hear me? Can you hear me clearly? Kuya Jeff, please feedback. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear, sir.
Thank you. So good afternoon from Baguio City. My name is Junli Lazaga. I'm very glad to be with you all today and welcome you and guide you through panel 8 of the third International Conference on Cordillera Studies. The paper presentations in this panel center on the theme of memory, tourism, and indigenous peoples. Our speakers are Ms. Lioba Piluden, Dr. Rita de los Reyes, and Dr. Jeremiah Dacusol. We will entertain questions after all the three papers have been presented. Our first speaker is Lioba Piluden. Ms. Piluden is from Mount Data, Mountain Province. She finished her Bachelor of Arts in Language and Literature degree at the University of the Philippines, Baguio, where she is also taking up her master's degree in the same field. She has taught research and literature courses at St. Mary's School of Sagada for 4 years before she moved to teach at the Faculty of Language and Literature at UP Baguio, where she is currently an instructor. Please welcome Lioba Piluden. Let's hear from her study of practical nostalgia and Sagada place memory in the commemorative practices of St. Mary's School of Sagada.
My name is Lioba Piluden and I am a graduate student under the MOL program of the College of Arts and Communication in the University of the Philippines, Baguio. Allow me to read this discourse analysis paper entitled Practical Nostalgia and Sagada Place Memory in the Commemorative Practices of St. Mary's School of Sagada. So the present discourse analysis on nostalgic remembering does not subscribe to the view of nostalgia as mere overt sentimentality or wishful coloring of the past, or rather the emotive dimensions of bad politics or bad history. More than being dismissed as bad history, nostalgia has the potential to deploy creative practices that actually promote a sense of progress instead of stasis. Indeed, a growing body of literature on nostalgia calls for its reassessment in light of how it is mobilized in specific cultural, historical, and spatial contexts. It is a nostalgia that can be used by communities to envisage new futures in which their own forms of social values matter, an expressive and creative activity grounded in the dynamics of everyday life, a potent coping mechanism in situations of self-threat and social threat, a rhetorical artifact of the politics of industrialization, and a form of power struggle in exhibiting competing understandings of modernity. Following this inquiry on nostalgia that is contextualized, practical, and productive, in this paper I look at the discursive ways by which the language of nostalgia is employed in the commemorative practices of St. Mary's School, an Anglican-affiliated secondary school in the center of Sagada Municipality and a remnant of American Episcopal missions in the Philippines from the beginning of the 20th century. These commemorative practices include tributes and memorials, homilies and speeches accompanying important celebrations such as the school's annual founding anniversary, commencement exercises, and alumni homecomings. The dialectical relationship between the texts and their accompanying performed practice is subjected here to a discourse analysis described by Fairclough as transdisciplinary, where the analysis of text is enhanced by operating through social theoretical perspectives, oscillating between the analysis of specific texts and the order of discourse. Themes that emerge through this discourse analysis suggest an overall positive evaluation of Mission Era Sagada, with its nostalgic commemoration providing discussion on colonial remembering, Sagada place memory, and the reconstruction of the indigenous self. We move on to the first part, which is commemorating the colonial indigenous encounter. So the Episcopal missions in Sagada began in 1904 upon the arrival of American missionary Reverend John Staunton as part of Bishop Charles Brent's campaign to spread the gospel deep into the Cordillera Central. Staunton adopted a holistic approach to the missions where he envisioned the church as serving not only a Christianizing but also a civilizing force. The vision of, according to Scott, a progressive community growing up around the mission like a pioneer settlement in colonial America. For the next decade, the mission would involve the operations of vocational centers that served the further expansion of the mission, resulting in employment, an increase in enrollment in the school, thousands of new converts, and more construction projects. Soon, the entire mission of St. Mary the Virgin became one of the outstanding achievements of the American occupation of the Philippine Islands and one of the most successful missions ever built by any denomination here in Asia. In the school's commemorative publications, missionary presence in Sagada is described with the quaint language that characterizes the pioneer narrative, with the Staunton's arrival and missionary work described as the very modest dream of a young couple who trudged through Spanish trails and reached Sagada with verve and energetic initiative. The process of the mission is described as a dream, a painful and prolonged process of realization, a blessing to the struggling infantile community. The nostalgic language used in the school's tributes and memorials are layered with positive rememberings of the colonial indigenous encounter. While the missionary as hero is typically the stuff of colonial historiography, many of those who remember do find personal meaning and fulfillment in the missionary encounter. To be sure, writes Lorkin, colonial nostalgia can incorporate colonial myths, but it is a collective sentiment that remains grounded in personal or familial experience in a way that myth does not. In the commemorative practices of the school, historic tensions along indigenous Christian lines is de-emphasized and made ambiguous. Benito Longdayan exhorts his classmates in a graduation speech delivered in 1932, and I quote, "Let us forget the fighting and ill will among our ancestors. The formation of the community is remembered to have involved more unity than division." While the missions are often subjected to nostalgic remembering, traditional Sagada and the pre-mission Igorot are not remembered with nostalgic longing at all. Pre-mission Sagada is described as a woeful landscape, an incomplete society, a vast desert of ignorance where the cause and effects of daily occurrences were mostly attributed to spirits, and where fear and suspicion dominated the land as men of the Ili could not go beyond the immediate confines of their own village. Paul Laos, in Impressions of an Igorot Boy, further writes, "When the mission was founded, the hard life of the Igorots got easier, happier, and better. As soon as the mission started its difficult work to help the poor and wild people, many were attracted. The mission also taught them some kind of work. Now there are expert native machine operators, printers, carpenters, stone cutters, plumbers, telephone operators, good doctor assistants, and primary intermediate school teachers." More than a parroting of a colonial narrative involving the missionary as hero, the remembering expresses what the native agent can accomplish, reflecting a dissatisfaction over an insular existence, an aspiration towards what Lorkin describes as an idealized vision of the intercultural relations within the colony that existed at that time. The interactions being remembered imagine a liminal space that challenges the white colonizer and indigenous victim binary. Moving on to the second part, reconstructing an indigenous identity. The post-war years saw a new wave of missionaries whose brand of mission is no longer aligned with the aims of a colonial government. It is in the period between the 1950s and 1960s that the school experienced a sort of renaissance. This period in the school's history is usually touted commemoratively as the school's golden age or glory days, with the school becoming a site of convergence for many students from various ili in the Old Mountain Province and other provinces, as well as a diverse faculty consisting of Igorot, Ilocano, and American teachers, the school performing and ranking excellently in national examinations, a feat that was almost unheard of for a rural school, and under the direction of then Principal William Henry Scott, contributing ethnographic and folkloric scholarship to Cordillera studies. In the tributes articulated by alumni members who remember the post-war wave of American missionaries, historic tensions are again either downplayed or made ambiguous, resulting in a prevailing narrative that conflates Christian and indigenous institutions as both Sagada heritage. It is a remembering that constructs an identity of a mission school that is not necessarily anathema to the indigenous institutions of the community. As expressed in one tribute, SMS nurtured our Christian upbringing, yet also allowed us to be proud of our cultural beginning. We embraced the concept of Lawa and Kasiyana in both beliefs. While we learned about Christianity, we also broadened our knowledge of the village's pagan rituals and beliefs. The use of quaint and parochial imagery also constructs a landscape suggesting one's humble childhood and school life to be juxtaposed with the present state of the Sagada landscape. It presents itself as steeped in the everyday aesthetic of pastness, using metonyms attached to place such as the ringing of the Angelus by classmates, studying using candles and the kerosene lamps, or sitting in Dapay Malingab with the elders. Moreover, academic excellence, discipline, and proficiency in English are mentioned as the hallmarks of this era in St. Mary's School. Graduates of the school position themselves as global citizens, and they depict themselves in this way as illustrated in the examples presented here in the slide. Was in SMS, I became aware and had a glimpse of the real world. I thought of Dr. Scott in history class as I stood where General Custer fell in the Battle of Little Bighorn. We can communicate with anybody, whether they are German, Australian, New Yorker, or an American born and bred in East Los Angeles. SMS alumni can easily fit in at services in Salisbury or Canterbury, etc. So, the discourse reveals a program of indigenous identity that is navigated and negotiated in a globalized context or within the translocal experience. The idealized past being remembered about the mission school is one that is both consciously local and also cosmopolitan, and because the past provides precisely an imaginative resource, a realm rich in invention, critical in possibility for people struggling with the present, what is also being secured is an aspirational Sagada that is able to reconcile its indigenous identity within a global context, a condition that is perceived to have been provided by the mission school experience. A similar order of discourse is also reflected in the language used by Sagada municipality in its own commemorative practice. For instance, in its annual town fiestas marketed to tourists as the Otag Festival. The Otag Festival, celebrated between January and February, feature themes such as nurturing our common origin amidst converging cultures, Dagup di Dapaya Simbahan, Syanan Mapkanya Sumyaan, cooperation amidst diversity, a celebration of an empowered community through faith and culture, and most recently, social dynamism towards church and cultural harmony. What such themes reveal is a discourse that presupposes a dichotomy between an indigenous identity and a Christian identity, framed as Dapay and church, culture and faith, and extended towards the confrontation between local identity and globalization. Nostalgia for the mission era past confounds such dichotomous relationships, and it becomes useful in making sense of a local economy that has allowed for more globalized confrontations, mass tourism, improving internet infrastructure, and other influences that are often depicted in nostalgic language as threats to community identity and cohesion. The school's commemorative language harnesses the most valuable practices of its history to propagate an ideal liminal space that is the project of Sagada. Moving on to the third and final part, reenacting Sagada place memory. The language used to describe the arrival of the American missions is adopted by alumni members in its own mission to sustain school operations amidst threats of bankruptcy and the opening of public schools within the municipality. As a former principal remarked, and I continue to dream, as the early missionaries did, that one day soon SMS will indeed have fulfilled the vision of its founding fathers. Nostalgic rememberings of the early missions are used as a rallying point in mustering continued support for the school. One important homecoming reunion is described as a gathering of lion-hearted eagles who refused to buckle under the threat of the school's perceived impending doom, an event filled with nostalgic euphoria as well as faith in the capacity of alumni and friends to revive a school apparently writhing in its death throes. While the school is no longer subsidized by the Episcopal Diocese, it would retain its identity and mission as a church-related institution, with church-related activities forming part of the school curriculum and the continuous observance of commemorative practices that transmit the remembrance of the American Episcopal missions in Sagada. One such practice is the school's Mountain Night celebrations, held on the eve or on the night of the school's designated founding anniversary. A mountain night can be traced back to the 1950s to the 1960s, referring to evenings spent rehearsing Western hymns with Kankanai lyrics. Today, Mountain Night is celebrated with community singing, dancing, pageants, and dap-ay performances from the students. And like its original purpose, it serves as a program where a revised Indigenous identity is constructed. Mountain Nights in SMS, as one alumni member would express, were a study in cultural, ritual, and livelihood. These are often manifested in the cultural performances from the four dap-ay of the school, namely Bilig, Lusban, Malingab, and Matoba, named after the major existing dap-ay of Central Sagada. The dap-ay performances incorporate metonyms of an imagined Sagada landscape, and among these metonyms are material culture suggesting traditional preoccupations before mission and industry. Later in the performances, new metonyms are introduced: the Holy Bible, or a figure in clerical robes suggesting the arrival of the missions. The missionary figure momentarily disrupts the cultural landscape reenacted in the dap-ay performances, but after a negotiation of some sort, in the form of dialogue with the squatted elders or the receiving of the Holy Communion, cultural life persists in some modified or hybrid capacity, expressed in the role play of a mission schoolboy navigating through village life, a more explicit exhortation delivered through Daieng, or by extension, wedding festivities between Igorot and non-Igorot. Through the use of metonyms that evoke the encounter of traditional Sagada life and the missions, Mountain Night reflects Sagada as liminal space, a counter-programming response to the overt romanticization of the pre-mission Igorot and to homogenizing forces within the global community, where the discourse of nostalgia makes, and I quote, a pragmatic claim on the present, using pastness as a naturalizing ideological strategy, end quote. Because these commemorative practices are ingrained in the school curriculum, St. Mary's School actively positions itself as a symbolic site where negotiations of the colonial indigenous encounter take place. What is also conflated is the narrative of the mission school and the Sagada narrative, so that St. Mary's experience cannot be separated from the Sagada experience. But to conclude, the commemorative practices of educational institutions reaffirm that institutions' values and relevance in time and place. In St. Mary's School, commemorative practices layered with nostalgic language imagine Mission Era Sagada as a conference of identities that narrate not only the institution but a place memory of Sagada that is both indigenous and Christian, traditional and globalized. A dialectical relationship emerges in how the nostalgic discourse of St. Mary's School actively constructs Sagada as cultural capital, as well as a program of indigenous identity that is strategic and negotiating, and how in turn Sagada's present economic directions fuel the nostalgic impulse that characterizes the commemorative practices of the school. The paper ends here. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Ms. Piluden. Again, welcome all to Panel 8, Memory, Tourism, and Indigenous Peoples. Our next speaker is Dr. Charita Arcangel de los Reyes, a professor of history at the UP Baguio and currently the director for student affairs at the same university. Dr. de los Reyes finished AB Political Science in 1989, magna cum laude, and an MA in Education, major in Administration and Supervision in 2001, cum laude, both at St. Louis University, Baguio City. Her other MA and her PhD, both in history, were obtained from the UP Diliman in 2004 and 2014, respectively. She has been twice a recipient of a Fulbright grant from the Philippine American Education Foundation Fulbright Commission in the Philippines. Her research interests include the history of education, institutional history, local history of Baguio specifically, urban history, gender and women history, social and cultural history, and colonial history. Please welcome, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. De Los Reyes to present her paper titled Popularizing a 20th Century Mountain Resort in Northern Philippines, Baguio City in a Metaphorical Language.
Good afternoon, everyone. My presentation is entitled Popularizing a 20th Century Mountain Resort, Baguio City in a Metaphorical Expression. My presentation includes conceptual metaphor theory, history and placemaking, conceptual metaphors for Baguio City, using figurative thought in historical context, conclusions. Part 1, conceptual metaphor theory, history and placemaking. The conceptual metaphor theory. Johnson in 1981 wrote that the late 1970s and early 80s will go down in history as the age for metaphor mania. Conceptual metaphor is not a linguistic form, but a figure of thought or a cognitive structure. The conceptual metaphor theory was first examined in the trailblazing work of George Lakoff and Mark Johnson's Metaphors We Live By. Both were considered to be the architects of the conceptual metaphor research because they introduced a cognitivist turn to metaphorical study. The main features of the conceptual metaphor theory include 1. Metaphors are all-pervasive. 2. Systematic mappings between two conceptual domains. 3. From concrete domain to abstract domain. 4. Metaphors primarily occur in thought. 5. Conceptual metaphors are grounded. And 6. The provenance of source domain. Here's the conceptual framework of my study. To the left is the spatial context, which is Baguio City. At the bottom is the temporal context, which is 1903 onwards. And at the center is a Venn diagram, which shows us the source domain and the target domain. At the center, which links both, are metaphorical mappings. Now, an example of a metaphorical mapping, metaphors are essential to thought and therefore to language. Some basic tenets have originated from the conceptual metaphor theory, namely 1. Metaphors structure thinking. 2. Metaphors structure knowledge. 3. Metaphor is central to abstract language. 4. Metaphor is grounded in physical experience. And 5. Metaphor is ideological. Language, history, and placemaking. Metaphorical language extracted from primary sources has proven what geographer Yi Fu Tuan writes as the power of language in the creation of place. Yi Fu Tuan describes place as a product of the physical transformation of nature, and further imparts that words alone, used in an appropriate situation, can have the power to render objects formerly invisible because unattended visible, and impart to them a certain character. Crowley privileges the use of metaphorical language in helping to construct historical formations such as nations, classes, genders, and races. Leary, on the other hand, supports this view by adding that metaphor permeates all discourse, ordinary and special. The social and political reality is linguistically made. Metaphor, too, has a role in constructing, modifying, and framing a place in relation to the political meanings it is desired to attach to it. Yi Futuan further writes that language is power in terms of its creative capability to make something into being, to render neutral meaningful, and to give or change characters for certain things. Language has the power to affix new label to old names and potentially wipe out the accumulated historical layers of meaning from memory and identity. European colonials used the power of metaphorical language to name, rename, replace, or sometimes adopt the indigenous place names in their colonized worlds. The power of naming place through linguistic expression is in proportion to both the duration of settlement history and the degree of domination, for instance, of the Americans over the indigenous Ibaloy. This undertaking dwells on how metaphors work in historical discourse, as it transcends space and time. The close interaction between language and meaning in history is further explained in Langer et al., who asserts that language is a primary means of access to the past, and the historian's primary means of expression. Langer maintains that language lives in people, and much historical evidence comes from records that people wrote using their languages. Yi Futuan reinforces this claim on the role of human speech in the creation of place. Metaphors thus serve as devices in conjuring imagery of place. The methodology that was employed in this study is textual analysis. It comprises three steps. The first one is data reduction or distillation, which refers to the identification of the smallest part of the units in historical texts, such as the snippets and vignettes of metaphorical expressions. Two would be data categorization, where collected data is classified according to their intrinsic similarities. Now, this stage describes the connection between the source domain and target domain, and the data interpretation, where the meaning of each data is directly presented when examining the relationship between the source and target domains. Part 2, Conceptual Metaphors for Baguio City. The forms of conceptual metaphors: 1. Nature metaphors, mechanistic, orientational, geographic mapping or landscape, mythic or fantastical metaphors, functional, physical or spatial metaphors, engine of growth metaphor, visual metaphors, and mixed metaphors. Nature metaphors are used to express people's understanding or interpretation of the world around them. Here are some examples: oasis in a sweltering tropical country, Baguio, the city of beauty and cool air, Baguio, the premier showplace of the islands because of its cool climate and picturesque location and environment. The climate in Baguio is very much like the Oregon climate. Baguio is also likened to the Adirondacks Mountains in New York and the Murray Bay in Canada. They have a very cool weather during the winter months and not excessively hot in the summer months. An all-year temperate climate in the very heart of the stifling tropic. The temperate beauty spot of the archipelago. Of Baguio, temperate climate in the tropics, mountain air and towering pines, a really clean city. The heavenly coolness, the sweet pine air, and the exquisite scenery give you new life after the years spent in the heat, glare, dust, and smells of the lowlands. And the lifeblood of a climate like ours again flows through my veins. The very air here is filled with champagne. That's according to journalist Carpenter. Baguio attracts visitors for many reasons. apart from the bracing climate, which is responsible for very romantic, misty mornings, lazy, foggy afternoons, and a proliferation of exotic semi-tropical plants, Baguio is an invigorating sports center. Baguio is known as the Pine City, the resort of pine trees and pine log fires, a region of pines and oaks, blessed by a perpetual temperate climate, the land of the pines, or the city of pines. Next are mechanistic metaphors, which have been defined as the assumption that nature is a sum of mechanical forces and parts in motion. Examples would be the only air-conditioned city in the Philippines, Asia's air-conditioned city. Orientational conceptual metaphor or the up-down metaphor pertain to concepts that are spatially related and interact with each other, such as the up-down, inside-out, front-back, in-out, on-off, deep-shallow, and center-periphery metaphors. Examples would be the junction of earth and clouds, a bit of heaven that fell on earth, a city above the clouds, cloud city, highland paradise, the journey upward and the return to the lowlands. Or it's a city among the clouds. It's known as the island in the sky, skyland of the Philippines, a city in the sky, Baguio, mountain city of the Philippine Islands, or a city on a hill. The next would be geographic mapping or landscape metaphors. Geographic metaphors refer to the notion that the theory of intelligence should provide a map of the mind, or map metaphors refer to verbal expressions of mapping aspirations which abound and took on almost poetic form. An example would be Baguio is not a place but a collection of places separated by pine-clad hills and lovely valleys. And because the Americans thought that Baguio was a home away from home, then they would name Baguio as Asia's Little America or an American city. Baguio is a Switzerland in the heart of the tropics. In Baguio, summer capital of the Philippines, on the roof of the world, how Uncle Sam has created a Switzerland. It's also known as Little Switzerland or a man-made Switzerland in the heart of the torrid zone. Simla of the Philippines or Philippine Simla, the second Simla, or Baguio will perform the same functions as a summer capital in the Philippines that Simla does in India. It's known as the Mecca of the Philippines, the health Mecca, or with Pacific tourist travel resumed, Baguio, summer capital of the Philippines, will again become the Mecca of the Americans. Landscape metaphors, for instance, Baguio is a residential park, a garden city, a city of parks, Philippine Garden of the Gods. It is a vast landscape garden designed by the creator and improved by man's efforts. Many world tourists who are competent to judge have pronounced it one of the most beautiful spots on earth. Stimulated by fantasy narratives and dreamscapes, fantastical or mythic metaphors refer to mental images or representation related to fantasy, myth, and dreams of pioneer travelers, adventurers, explorers, prospectors, settlers, and tourists in Baguio. Mythic or fantastical metaphors. Examples: Shangri-La did exist, tourists Eden, Philippine Wonderland, the enchanting wonderland of the Orient. Baguio is a wonder spot in the Orient, one of the world's show places with nature staging the show. Baguio is an immaculate summer resort, scenery, cool air, a resident colony of splendid people, outdoor pleasure, and indoor gaiety. Baguio, the fairyland of the Philippines. For here is a fairyland of green, gardens, beautiful walks, and easily accessible peaks commanding exquisite vistas of valleys and neighboring mountain tops. Baguio is a paradise city and highland paradise, a bit of heaven that fell on earth. Or Anderson would say, we had ascended into paradise from purgatory. Baguio is, perhaps, the first place in the country where ecumenism took an early and firm root. Next, we have functional or spatial metaphors. A functional metaphor creates an environment where objects perform the functions they depict. Functional metaphors provide clues as to how Baguio City should essentially be valuable to interpret in its infrastructure for design and policy making. So this type of metaphor also involved travel within space, both physical and social, thus the term spatial metaphors. Examples of which include 1. Health resort, summer capital, chartered city, mountain or summer resort, and site for conferences, sports center, educational center, artist sanctuary, lover's haven, and metaphors of virtue. Baguio, the health resort of the Philippines, the Mecca of the Americans, Mecca for all Americans in the Philippines, health and tourist Mecca, health Mecca of the archipelago, health resort and beauty spot of the Philippines, better than a doctor, Baguio. Remember, Baguio is the place for health, for pleasure, for relaxation. Baguio is the summer capital of Benguet. It's growing by rapid strides and new and substantial buildings are springing up on every side. So Baguio was the summer capital officially and socially. Baguio was at one time the summer capital of the Philippines, the summer capital in the mountains. Already, Baguio is known all over the Far East, and to visit Manila and not make a trip to the summer capital is to miss the pleasantest feature of life in the Philippines. A vacation in Baguio will make him a new man and restore him to optimism. Baguio was the first Philippine city after Manila to be chartered, so that's the Baguio's chartered city. The summer or mountain resort. So Baguio, the world's finest mountain resort. Baguio is without doubt the most beautiful and most healthful mountain resort in the Far East. Baguio is the most delightful place for a vacation in the entire Orient. Baguio is regarded as the premier mountain resort of the Far East and one of the finest in the world, one of unrivaled charm, a wonderland of rest and recreation, wonders of vacation land, a pleasure resort. It's also a site for conferences, so descriptions such as a convention city or the Philippine Chautauqua because of teachers' camp. No? Baguio Sports Center, so we have the playground and health resort of the Philippines, sport and health resort, Baguio Sports Center and mountain resort, Baguio the playground of the nation, playground of the Orient, the city sports mecca. Baguio's Educational Center, so words such as Citadel of Learning, a haven for the researcher and the thinker, Educational Center of Northern Luzon, the Educational Center of the North, or Prime Educational Center north of Manila, University Town, a home to a number of major higher education hubs, or the center of tertiary institution in the region. Artist sanctuary and cultural oasis. So we have a multi-ethnic city, a writer's haven, a hotspot for the arts, an artist's haven, home to hundreds of art spaces and galleries, a refuge for cinema's arts, a refuge among artists, a vibrant city, a creative city. A haven for lovers, such as a honeymooner's paradise, lover's lair, honeymoon capital, gold capital, and playground of the Orient, burnt out hearts. If you can see the picture here, that's President Emilio Aguinaldo, who was 61 years old when they had a honeymoon with a very young 49 years old wife, Maria Agoncillo. So we also have metaphors of virtue, such as the character city, to describe Baguio. Okay, charismatic city, because we have managed to retain our old school charm and cool climate. So the engine of growth is an example of a mechanist metaphor, no, to use Sheehan's words. So, in the context of this study, it is a phrase that is occasionally used to define the role that something, such as tourism, investment, or the vegetable industry, may have played to produce a desirable result, such as the proliferation of a thriving local economy. So, examples of these include Baguio as investment mecca of the Cordillera, a center for market gardening, a western mining town, a city of eternal spring, season in bloom, metropolis of the mountain province, Baguio, gateway to Wonderland, gateway city to the Cordilleras, Cordillera Gateway, and a gateway to the wonders of northern Luzon, the gateway to the enchanting wonderland of the mountain province, the center of business, tourism, and education in northern Luzon, the only city in the Philippines with the most public parks and pocket gardens with unique plant and flower varieties found nowhere else. Baguio as northern Luzon's leading dairy center. It's the regional capital, tourism city, a heritage and historic city. We have the next, the visual metaphor, pictorial metaphor, or analogical juxtaposition. This refers to the representation of a person, place, thing, or idea by means of a visual image that suggests a particular association or point of similarity. So, in some of these advertisements by the Manila Railroad Company, we can see in its ad the following lines: Visit Baguio, the resort of the Philippines, pine trees and pine log fires. Visit Baguio, the great health and pleasure resort of the Philippines. Summer again, then go to Baguio. Baguio as the best summer resort in the Orient is already an accepted fact. Then we have metaphors of unpleasantness such as Baguio as the earthquake zone or Baguio air is among the dirtiest in the country. Mixed metaphors such as high up in the mountains, the summer capital of the islands is a perfect gem of beauty, or honeymoon capital, gold capital, and playground of the. Part 3, using figurative thought in historical context. Friel in 1981 argues that it is not the literal past, the facts of history that shape us, but images of the past embodied in language. Underhill continues to say that language allows us to assimilate the world into consciousness, but our world will always be given to us in the form of a representation, a model, rather than a graspable reality which can be mastered. This representation is in the form of words, of conceptual metaphors, which could be better understood if situated in its historical contexts. Contextual factors are important in understanding the meaning making behind conceptual metaphors. Our world is comprised of people, the physical environment, the social aspects of the setting in which they act, and the larger cultural context. Also, locating these at different points in time or the temporal context is rather imperative. The physical environment embraces a specific geography, landscape, fauna and flora, dwellings, other people, and the like that speakers of a language or variety interact with on a continual basis. The Americans, living in a certain kind of natural and physical environment, when moved to a new and very different natural and physical environment, will always find some association with the original environment and transplant an almost similar representation in the new habitat. In this instance, Baguio City has been likened to the Adirondack Mountains in New York, the Murray Bay weather in Canada, the Simla of the British Raj in India, or the Switzerland in the tropics. Social factors play a role in influencing the general metaphorical patterns of society. An example of these in metaphorical expression is the distinction between men and women in different societies. Annette Kalodny points out that men thought of the frontier as a virgin land to be taken, whereas women thought of it as a garden to be cultivated. In terms of cultural context, This meant the exclusive and relevant concepts and values that describe specific subcultures with the prevailing principles of a particular culture or subculture. Baguio's description as the playground of the Orient is indicative of the game conceptual metaphor that permeates American culture. Labeling Baguio as creative city resonates from the recognition of the UNESCO of the ethnic arts that abound this culture zone, such as the weaving, sculpture, tattooing, and handicrafts tradition. Part 4 Conclusion. Langer, Davis, and Van den Busch in 2012 puts that terms are historical constructions, and language itself is always represented in metaphors. These figurative words serve as powerful devices of persuasion, and they can be effective devices of attention grabbing that show the dynamic role of language, texts, and narrative structures in the construction of historical reality. Most of our evidence has come from language, from the meanings of words and phrases, and from the way humans make sense of their experience. In this study, these were the figures of thought depicted in the vignettes and snippets extracted from primary sources on the building up, promotion, popularization, and development of Baguio as a mountain resort since the American colonial period until the present times through conceptual, cognitive, or embodied metaphoric language. Conceptual metaphor function as framing devices and by itself are perspectival. These metaphorical expressions are useful in history because they facilitate comparison and provides a way of referring to human experience. In naming and placemaking from a temporal context, Baguio's urban history is very much historically and culturally conditioned through conceptual metaphors. The concepts have started to lead their own life and have almost become tourism imaginaries in their own right, socially transmitted representational assemblages that are used as meaning making and world shaping devices in Baguio's urban history and beyond. Thank you.
Okay, salamat po, Dr. De Los Reyes. Hello again to all our participants from different parts of the globe joining here on Zoom and tuning in on YouTube. We continue with the third and last, but certainly not the least, presentation in this panel on memory, tourism, and indigenous peoples. Our speaker, Dr. Jeremiah Dacusol, teaches research as a faculty member at the University of Baguio. She finished her Doctor of Philosophy in Rural Development at the Benguet State University in La Trinidad, Benguet in 2019. Let's please listen to Dr. Dacusol on her study in structuring indigenous ecotourism in cultural communities.
Hello everyone, I am Jeremiah K. Dacusol and I will be presenting a study entitled Structuring Indigenous Ecotourism in Rural Communities. Tourism is considered as one of the world's largest growing industry globally. As such, it can both have positive and negative impact to the environment, to the local community, and to the local people as well. Inappropriate tourism development can lead to loss of culture, loss of habitat, destruction of the environment and natural resources, and it can even lead to waste and pollution. On the other hand, responsible tourism development can generate awareness and understanding that can also lead to preservation of the natural environment, protection of biodiversity, and it can even generate income for host communities and local people as well. With its perceived potential, most developing countries and developed countries as well considers ecotourism as an effective tool for sustainable development. The reason why many countries are embracing this kind of development, and they are including now ecotourism activities in their economic development and conservation strategies. Ecotourism development policy started to be realized in the Philippines in 1991 with the crafting of its 2020 midterm development plan, wherein the Philippine Department of Tourism, in partnership with the United Nations Development Organization and the World Trade Organization, crafted guidelines for ecotourism development in the Philippines, which focuses on the conservation of the natural environment, preservation of natural resources, and the purpose also of giving socio-economic benefits to the concerned communities. With this, the researcher conducted this particular study in one of the municipalities in Mountain Province, here in the Cordillera Administrative Region, particularly in Barlig Mountain Province. This is one of the 11 municipalities in the eastern part of located in the eastern part of Mountain Province. It is considered as a developing ecotourism frontier. However, it is still considered as a fifth-class municipality. 30 key informants were chosen to participate in this study. 4 of them represents the municipal local government unit, which includes the municipal mayor during that time, the head of the Municipal Tourism Office, the chairman of Tourism Development in the Sangguniang Bayan, and the head of the Municipal Agriculture Office. 26 of the key informants were from people's organizations and the host communities as well. And this includes barangay captains, youth representatives, owners and managers of restaurants, inns, or tourist homestays, elders of the community, representatives from the transport group, which are drivers, and representative from tour guides as well. The researcher formulated at least 5 objectives in this particular study. And with each objective, she included social, technological, environmental, economic, and political aspect, which were used as her guidelines in formulating her key interview guide questions to the key informants. So the first objective is that the researcher wanted to identify the activities undertaken by the municipal and barangay local government unit in terms of ecotourism development in Barlig as to the 5 areas that were mentioned. The second objective is that the researcher wanted to explore the initiatives that were undertaken also by the host communities in terms of ecotourism development in the area as to social, technological, environmental, economic, and political aspect. The third objective was that the researcher wanted to assess the challenges that were encountered both by the municipal or barangay local government unit and the host communities along ecotourism development as to the 5 areas. The fourth objective is that the researcher wanted to determine the preferences of tourists, whether they are international, national, or local, as perceived by the local people. And lastly, The researcher also explored the perceived benefits along ecotourism development as to social, technological, environmental, economic, and political aspect. With the use of exploratory, qualitative design, and thematic analysis, accompanied by focus group discussions and one-on-one interview, the following findings were revealed in this particular study. So when it comes to ecotourism activities, there are such activities conducted by the municipal local government unit and the barangay local government unit from the social aspect, which includes basic life support trainings, technological, which includes the construction of a satellite transmitter. So this is in partnership of the local government unit and Globe Telecommunications Company. As to environmental, there are cleanup drives conducted by MLGU and BLGU. There are livelihood projects that sustain the economic aspect. This is in partnership with TESDA, Department of Trade and Industry, Department of Tourism, and Department of Labor and Employment as well. As for the political aspect, well, the MLGU and BLGU imposes the guidelines of Republic Act 9003, which is the Solid Waste Management Act of the Philippines. When it comes to the initiatives of host communities, there are now limited, as revealed by the responses of the key informants, especially when it comes to environment and political activities. So, almost all the key informants revealed that they are not aware of such, or they do not have such initiative actually. As to the challenges, it was revealed that there are many and various challenges when it comes to ecotourism development in Barlig Mountain Province, such that the following were revealed by the key informants. So there is the absence of evaluation tools. Thus, there is no clear feedback regarding tour guide services, accommodations, and tourist satisfaction as well. Another big challenge for the municipality is that the absence of municipal tourism website. So it was revealed by the key informants that most of the tourists who visits the municipality knows such tourist spots because of referral of some of their friends or through the word of mouth. As to the livelihood projects that were conducted or established, there is no sustainability actually, such that those projects ends up immediately after being turned over to the People's Organization by TESDA, by DTI, or Department of Tourism. Even if there is the implementation of Solid Waste Management Act, it was revealed by the key informants that most of the tourist spots are not monitored properly, such that there are still huge amount of garbages that are left behind not only by tourists but by local people also who visits these tourist spots. As to the preferences of tourists, this was gathered based on the ideas and perceptions of the community members. Why? Initially, the researcher wanted to gain first-hand information regarding preferences of tourists by interviewing at least some tourists who visits the municipality. However, data gathering took place from December 2018 until April 2019. If we can still remember, October 2018 was the time when Typhoon Rosita devastated and damaged the eastern part of Mountain Province. That's why during the time that the researcher was gathering data, it was also a time when the municipality have experienced this destruction of tourist spots. Farm to market roads were even damaged during that time, and even some of the tourist spots that were destroyed during Typhoon Rosita were completely damaged, such that they are not restored even up to the present. So during that time, it was considered that the municipality was still closed for tourist visitation because of that kind of situation. That is why the researcher was not able to gain first-hand information from tourists. Luckily, during the focus group discussion and key informants interview, these preferences of tourists were already included in the responses of the key informants as they were telling their experiences, as they were sharing their ideas and opinions. The reason that the researcher was able to document some of the preferences of tourists as perceived by the community members. As to the perceived outcomes of ecotourism, there are limited perceived outcomes as revealed by the key informants. However, it is still striking to know that at least they are aware on some positive and negative outcomes if ecotourism will be developed properly or inappropriately. So as to the social aspect, they were able to reveal such perceived outcomes, both on positive and the negative side. As for technological, they just perceived the construction of souvenir shops since there is no building that is considered as a pasalubong center in the municipality. Most of the people who are engaged in innovation and souvenir making are private individuals. They also perceived the increase of infrastructure projects, especially farm-to-market road. As for economic, most of them look into employment or creation of job. As for environmental and political, they were able to reveal these limited responses as well. In conclusion, the researcher was able to assess that Barlig is blessed with various natural and man-made tourist spots. Actually, there were 28 tourist spots that were recorded and documented during the conduct of this particular study. Amidst the activities by the MLGU and BLGU, what is lacking is a clear information dissemination such that host communities are not aware on some of these activities for ecotourism development. It was also revealed that there is a low political will among the host communities and the local people, such that they are mostly dependent to the municipal and barangay local government unit regarding their mandate on ecotourism development. That is why most of the locals do not yet fully understand and foresee the outcome of ecotourism development. As such, the researcher came up with this particular framework of her own in order to highlight the overall findings and and what needs to be addressed for ecotourism development in this municipality. So when we say ecotourism development, it does not only lie on the role of the government. The government sector and the community should have a clear, transparent information dissemination or ecotourism advocacy in order for them to come up with a comprehensive investment plan that will incorporate the social, technological, environmental, economic, and political aspect. And included in this should be the best practices such as the culture and environment conservation practices of the people. If this is realized both by the government and the community, and they can come up with a comprehensive investment plan, they will clearly foresee the perceived positive outcomes of ecotourism development, such that it will now lead them to come up with clear guidelines in order to attain sustainable agro-ecotourism industry. Overall, we should also consider and always think that ecotourism development should always be culture-based, such that this kind of development should not sacrifice the culture of the people, especially the host communities. It should be inclusive because all people involved or all sectors that are involved should be included in the policy making. They might be from the government, the host communities, or people's organization. In order for them to participate properly in coming up with ecotourism development policies, such that at the end, ecotourism development plans and activities will be sustainable. With that, thank you everyone.
Salamat po. Thanks for those informative and insightful presentations, articulating matters of memory, tourism, and indigenous peoples, extending to specific examinations of signifying practices through verbal language in the paper of Miss Peluden, language and metaphor in the framing of a city in the paper of Dr. De Los Reyes, and physical structural materials, information, and technology collectively taken as a way to look into gaining insights in developing sustainable ecotourism programs in the paper presentation of Dr. Jeremiah Dacusol. We are now ready for the open forum. For your questions, you may please click the raise hand button and wait to be acknowledged, or type your questions in the chat box so that I may read them out for you. In the interest of time, you are encouraged to keep your questions brief and concise. Thank you. May we now have the first question from the chat box from Roy Hapasi. Thank you for the question. I'll read it out for the speakers. How important are labels or metaphors for Baguio City? I think this is specifically for Dr. De Los Reyes. It has been long tagged as the city of pines, but we see less and less of pine trees in the city. There are tourists that visit Baguio, and sadly, they were disappointed upon seeing high-rise hotels and condos instead of mountain ranges of lush pine trees. Are the indigenous peoples communities in Bar League in full agreement to tourism? This one for Dr. Jeremiah. And the follow-up is that what are their initial hesitations in opening the province to ecotourism? I think we can have the first question with Dr. De Los Reyes first, ma'am.
I think I just have to turn off my video. It's not working well, no?
Welcome.
Okay, yes. Well, thank you very much, Sir C, for your question. No? It's about the importance of language in promoting Baguio, the popularization of Baguio. I use that. This particular study has been very interesting for me because first and foremost, when I was going through the archival primary sources, it said no that Baguio City stopped. Actually, if you see, was no it past tense stopped to be the summer capital in 1909. No? Particularly, even strictly speaking, 1913 when Harrison became the Governor General, and the Democratic bloc in the United States really want to stop any initiative to develop Baguio. They even saw Baguio as a white elephant project, and you will see that in the 1911 documents. Now, and that's the reason why they really had to stop it. Now, because it has to stop. And another thing is, we were unofficially the summer capital of the Philippines. We were officially declared as a chartered city in 1909, but not as such a summer capital. No, while we know that the very first session happened here, no, and that really made us acquire the name of summer capital, it was not officially legislated, and therefore the Americans had really wanted to develop Baguio because no funds are already coming from Washington D.C. or from the government in Manila, and that's the reason why they had to use now tourism as a way to popularize Baguio, and that's through metaphors. This thing that you have heard earlier, no, the how I have categorized all these snippets and vignettes, no, that's what they used. In fact, these metaphors are still being used now to describe Baguio positively or negatively, no, with what tourists say now about the cutting of trees and the high-rise buildings is expected. But the use of metaphors is still ongoing. No, whether we say will Baguio become a smart city, will it become a resilient city, is all up to us now to prove. But nonetheless, metaphors are really important. No, language really shape our historical reality, not only during the past but up to the present.
Thank you, ma'am. We'll have the next question response from Dr. Jeremiah.
Wait. Hello po, good afternoon. Yes, sir. I'm currently reading my your questions. As to agreement to tourism, from the responses of the key informants, they are actually in agreement regarding ecotourism development. Even representatives, when I conducted a one-on-one interview, were in agreement with ecotourism development because they see ecotourism as one channel wherein it will help economic aspect of the community, since it is considered as a fifth-class community. However, their hesitations actually, or the reasons why they are not fully aware, is that first, it has something to do with the political aspect. I mean, the organization in the municipal local government unit. For the previous years, there is no particular person or a permanent person to occupy the municipal tourism office. So for the previous years, always the head of the municipal tourism office is appointed as an officer in charge. That's why the activities that were conducted suddenly stopped if there is another person who will be appointed. That's why these people, especially from the host communities, cannot see the continuation of this ecotourism development from the municipal level itself. Although the municipal local government argues that there are some, okay, to justify their activities, pero hindi ito na-appreciate ng host communities. Another one is there is no clear-cut policies regarding ecotourism development forwarded to host communities. Okay? That's why tourists only know of one particular tourist spot in Barlig, which is Mount Amuyao, which is very good for hiking purposes, hiking and trekking. So it means when it comes to income, it is biased because only one barangay collect entrance fee and environmental fee, while the other barangays were not properly promoted actually because they also do not know how do they promote the tourist spots such as waterfalls, hot spring, hot springs, and the other eco parks that are present in the other barangays. So the problem here is that there is no really clear, transparent communication between these sectors in the community, MLGU and the host communities. But when it comes to being open to tourists, Barlig has been open to tourists. The reason that, may I just share this one? This is one experience for this is one experience from the community that inspired me to conduct this study. If we are aware of the South Korean who was lost in the mountains of the Cordillera, we were highlighted regarding that particular issue. We were highlighted in the national and even in the international news. Actually, it was in Barlig. The specific location was in Barlig. The reason that this particular Korean just entered the community and the people just accepted him, while in fact he was rejected in Sagada Mountain Province because he was not able to comply with tour guide policies. Okay, he just want to roam around Sagada without a tour guide, hindi siya pinayagan. But since Barlig was relaxed during that time, they accepted him even if he does not have a tour guide, he did not comply with the tourism policies, kaya nangyari yung incident na yon. So when I was actually conducting this study, lumabas yung issue na yon, and the host communities actually are aware na if we could only come up with these proper guidelines so as to help also our tourists who visit our community and to avoid those incidents in the future. Yun po.
Thank you, ma'am. Are there any more questions? Or perhaps Ms. Piluden would like to respond also to the question and link to her paper?
Hello. I think maybe just with regards to the first question directed to Professor De Los Reyes about the importance of metaphors or labels. Maybe just a reiteration of what I've already presented in the paper. Much of what Sagada municipality uses in its marketing of the municipality in the Itag Festival finds it has there are parallelisms, there are re-echoes with the nostalgic language being used in the mission school and in the church, and that is the coming together, the dagup between Dapay and church. And while there are historic tensions, these are things that are downplayed and are not really mentioned. And so ayun, just the emphasis on that liminality, which I think is Sagada is known for, the ability to be enterprising but at the same time still have their traditions intact.
Salamat, LA. For all the panelists, this is a question from, I believe, Professor Vicky Diaz. What do you think are the measures to mitigate or prevent the effects of over-tourism, that is commodification of culture, solid waste management, etc.? Maybe go back to Professor De Los Reyes first, ma'am.
I was just thinking if we could also follow what they did to Boracay, that they had to close it for months, no, in order to rehabilitate the city. other than that, we also have to be very strict in implementing what we have laws that were passed on by the government regarding environmental sanitation, pollution control, and the like. Well, the rehabilitation thing about Baguio City should also include here provision for the garbage, etc. Because tourism in the past has really aggravated our problem regarding garbage. No, and for a time it has really been an eyesore for tourists. No, whenever they talk about Baguio, what they remember is pollution. What they remember is pollution equivalent to 2 packs of cigarette. No, all these things. That's why for a time we had a negative metaphor, no, used to describe Baguio, no, the dirtiest city in the Philippines. But other than that, I think it's not just one or two agencies, no, that really have to work hand in hand, no, in order to effect changes, no, but it's really an overhauling of the entire system, rethink, no, what kind of tourism that we really want for the city. If we want to promote Baguio as a creative city, no, UNESCO gave us that label in 2017, so why not promote, no, those that are really that would really give emphasis to what is typically ours, what we can be proud of in the international community. So folk arts is there, no, we have our tattooing, weaving, no, etc. I think that we can capitalize on nowadays because of this pandemic. No, people became very they have developed the plantdemic culture. No, we see now how plants, no, fauna, no, and flora, sorry, has been developed. No, people, there's a proliferation of this, not as a source of income, and this is now another thing that tourists perhaps they come up to Baguio for this. But I think that well, for one, I have to agree that we really have to close Baguio for months to tourists.
Thank you, Ma'am Chat. Before I call Dr. Jeremiah, I'm sorry. This is not a question from Professor Diaz. I'd like to recognize Miss Vicky. Thank you for the question. Dr. Jeremiah, your response, please.
Again, sir, is it about something that could mitigate the negative impact? Sorry, the question, sir.
What do you think are the measures, ma'am, to mitigate or prevent the effects of over-tourism, like commodification of culture, solid waste management, and perhaps other effects of tourism?
Okay. I think political will has a great impact to ecotourism development. Political will not only from the institutionalized agency, which is the government, but mostly from the people, the host communities. If we can make people realize that that kind of development is their own, they take ownership on that kind of development, they themselves would protect this kind of ecotourism activities. But political will is very hard. From this kind of study that I conducted, political will has something to do with leadership. Leadership not only from the government but from the people as well. So yun yung parang driving force, political will and leadership, so that in the end, when people appreciates the benefit of ecotourism development, they will be the one to protect also the natural environment. They will be the one to protect their culture, okay? And they will be the one to, in the end, mitigate the negative impact of over ecotourism. But of course, the role of the government to come up with comprehensive ecotourism development plan will also be a guide kasi they are the structured agency in the community. So in coming up with that, it will become a guide if it will be channeled to all the host communities that this is the guideline, and continuous communication, transparent information dissemination, continuous activities like those will, I think, make people realize the the impact of ecotourism development.
I think we have another question from Ms. Maridel Di Maculangan. Thank you for the question. Perhaps this will be our last questions with which our speakers can give their parting words. The question is, what can you say about local governments who are trying to promote ecotourism for migrant IP communities without proper understanding of IP culture because they are outsiders from the IP community? And we have De Los Reyes response.
Director Junli, can we request first Ms. Piluden also to give an answer first, because I think it's typical of the Sagada experience.
Okay, ma'am. Ma'am Piluden.
Perhaps I can remark on the previous question as to over tourism, and I think it just goes without saying that the situation in because Sagada is compared to Baguio, it's relatively culturally homogeneous. So you've got almost everyone is indigenous. So I can only speak, I can only remark on the previous question, and the fact that the place is ayun nga, culturally homogeneous, and I will contend nostalgia has something to do with it. Nostalgia for this particular era in the past. No, over tourism is I think impossible in Sagada because the folks there are not beholden to tourists. And if Ubaya is declared, which is a holiday, holiday declared by the DAPI, tourists have no say where that's where they are prohibited from entering certain tourist spots. So I really think that the situation in Sagada is still there is still control from the DAPI, and I think that's pretty much it.
Thank you. Ma'am Charita, would you like to respond?
The thing is, paradoxical, no? It's quite an opposite, no, of that of Sagada. Baguio is a melting spot, no, a melting pot of different races, of different cultures, no, and in fact, this is the problem now with regard to what we consider as IP culture, becoming now. I mean, we're more peopled by Ilocanos and Pangasinenses now, more than the Ibaloys. No? So I guess there's a very crucial role in promoting culture through education. No? Even our Department of Tourism has been actively wanting to revive or to bring back what is really indigenous in culture. I remember Director Tan, Venus Tan, used to invite UP Baguio to talk about what is really nice in promoting the Cordillera region. For instance, why not talk about, let's say, food? Na? How do we bring back or introduce to them food in the region? No? So as you visit one province to the other, let's offer what's uniquely ours in the region. Now, in the case of this is in terms of how tourism is going now, no, going about in the city. I just don't know with the new director. I don't think we have a new director for tourism. I think an OIC, no, Gladys Vergara, no. So I think there are also initiatives, no, to revive, no, or to stimulate. I don't know if that's the right word, no, or to beef up, no, whatever we have missed, no, because of too much emphasis on globalization, deliberalization, etc., liberalization, etc. So I am still very hopeful, no, that initiatives are going. Even in the DepEd, diba, you take a look at our use of the language. I hear students, no, sing in the indigenous songs, no. I just hope that they are interpreted for these students to be able to appreciate what they're singing. But there's collaborative effort, and I'm keeping my fingers crossed now that local culture is promoted and respected, no. In fact, I just came from the lecture of I think panel 3, no, and I appreciated how Dr. Canilao, no, Canilao's talk on recognition, and you talk about sustainability, which is cognizant not only of political, economic, no, environmental, but also of the cultural aspect, no, for us to be able to subsist in the next years to come.
Thank you, ma'am. May we have Dr. Jeremiah Tapusol, please, ma'am?
Okay. For me, local governments should be very careful in promoting ecotourism, especially to migrant IPs or our tourists, even if they are not international, okay, even if they are Filipinos. But I think one activity to be conducted is that, aside from collecting environmental fee, entrance fee, and tour guide fees, let tourists sit or be oriented first before they roam around the community. At least there should be a short orientation that would present to them what the community is all about, what are the people in that community, what are their culture, and how do they protect the environment, so that at one point, or these tourists would at least have an idea that will guide them how to deal with the people in the community, how to deal with the natural environment when they will be visiting these tourist spots, and how would they take part in the culture of the people. Usually in ecotourism development, what is primarily sacrificed is either culture or the natural environment. So dapat ito yung protektahan ng mga local governments. Of course, we do not select people to be tourists. Hindi naman pwede yon. But yun nga, local governments who opt to fully open their communities to migrant IP or non-members or to any kind of tourists should at least have these activities. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. That has been a thought-provoking conversation with our speakers. On behalf of all our participants from Facebook, from YouTube, thank you to all our speakers. Yaman kami. To all our participants, thank you. I think we can now conclude this panel.